Good evening. I'm Matthew Spaulding. I'm the Associate Vice President and Dean for Hillsdale College here in Washington, D.C. As you know, Hillsdale College is an old college, and it's not in D.C., but this is our Washington, D.C. campus, and I welcome you to it, where we extend our teaching mission about liberal arts, but also the principles and institutions of American government. We have undergraduates, programs, a fellowship program for young professionals, and very soon, if all goes well, a graduate school here in Washington, D.C. to teach these ideas. In short, to teach people what they need to know to be a statesman. One of the things we're very interested in teaching on our main campus and here are the arts of liberty, as we call them, the things one needs to know to maintain liberty, which depend on a constitution and its structure, as Madison would emphasize in the Federalist Papers, things like the separation of powers, but also this other institutional structure called the Electoral College. And I'm very happy to say we have an excellent, an expert on the question and a good friend of mine who's also engaged in the current debate. Trent England is the Executive Vice President at the Oklahoma Council of Public Affairs, where he's also the David and Ann Brown Distinguished Fellow and directs the Save Our States Project. He's an adjunct fellow of New Mexico's Rio Grande Foundation, and he hosts a podcast. He's actually previously did morning radio, but he has a podcast called The Trent England Show. He previously served as the Executive Vice President of the Freedom Foundation and was a legal policy analyst at the Heritage Foundation. And he was also a candidate for Washington State House of Representatives, their loss, because he's with us today. He's written for numerous publications, including the Wall Street Journal, Christian Science Monitor, the Washington Times. He's contributed to an excellent publication, well edited, called The Heritage Guide to the Constitution. And he also contributed to One Nation Under Arrest, How Crazy Laws, Rogue Prosecutors, and Activist Judges Threaten Your Liberty. He earned his J.D. from George Mason University's School of Law, and his B.A. in Government from Claremont McKenna College, where I'm very sad to say, makes me feel old and makes him young, where he was my student. Those many years ago, and despite that, he's gone on to be a fine scholar. So I give you Trent England.
Thank you all so much. Thank you, Matt. It's just a pleasure to be here and be introduced by you. And I'd be remiss if I didn't also say thank you to Doug Jeffrey from Hillsdale, and also, of course, President Larry Arnn. And just to say something before I get into my remarks about the importance of what they do here, I was thinking as I was preparing all of this, I was thinking about when I got interested in the Electoral College as a topic of study. And it was before the Electoral College was cool, before 2000, because of the story one professor at Claremont McKenna College told about another professor. The professor was Michael Ullman, telling a story about Martin Diamond, who just down the street from here testified in 1977 before a Senate committee that was hearing a proposal to abolish the Electoral College. And at the end of that hearing, he stood up and he began to walk out, and he fell over and died of a heart attack. And it just stuck in my mind as this young kid. This image, it was the one image I had of this valiant scholar of politics and our constitutional regime who sort of died with his boots on. I thought, I'm happy to survive, but I want to be that kind of scholar, right? And it left me with this interest in the Electoral College that has lived on these many years. So let me tell you the story of the Electoral College. Once upon a time, the Electoral College was not controversial. In the ratification debates, the anti-federalist critics of the Constitution barely brought it up, barely had anything to say about the Electoral College. Yet by the 20th century, opponents had nearly convinced Congress two different times, once in 1977, once earlier in the 50s, largely stopped by John F. Kennedy. Bipartisan critics of the Electoral College almost convinced Congress to pass out an amendment to abolish this whole system. What happened? And does it even matter? I mean, critics of the Electoral College point out they're merely trying to get the president elected the way we elect pretty much everybody else who's elected in our country. Governors are all elected by a statewide popular vote, so why not a national popular vote for president? In 1787, the framers of the Constitution asked themselves the same question. They considered and rejected a national popular vote along with several other possible modes of election. The Virginia plan, the first draft of what would become the new Constitution, called for a national executive to be chosen by the national legislature. When the Constitutional Convention took up this issue for the first time about a week into their debates, Pennsylvania's James Wilson called for a popular election, and Roger Sherman from Connecticut jumped up to support the Virginia plan's parliamentary system, arguing that the executive should be, quote, absolutely dependent on the legislature. Virginia's George Mason responded that a popular election was impracticable, but he hoped that Wilson would, quote, have time to digest the plan into his own form. Another delegate said that the Senate should have that power, and then the convention adjourned for the day. And when they came back the next day, on Saturday morning, it turned out that Wilson had taken Mason's advice. He presented a plan to create districts and hold popular elections to choose electors, and those electors would then go on to vote for the executive. In other words, Wilson proposed an electoral college so early in the Constitutional Convention, but with many details left out, and the whole nature of the executive undecided, right? The whole question of whether we would have one president or a council, or, I mean, all this was up in the air. Wilson's proposal was voted down. A week later, Massachusetts delegate Elbridge Gerry proposed election by state governors. This too was voted down, but a theme begins to appear. Delegates did not defend the Virginia plan's parliamentary model so much as they criticized the other plans that were brought up as having some of the same flaws or other flaws themselves. Yes, an executive elected by Congress might be subservient to that body, but a similar result could be expected from giving that power to any other body of elected officials. In July, there was a proposal, I like this one, there was a proposal to draw lots in Congress to select electors, and then all those, whichever members of Congress drew out the right colored balls out of the jar, they actually talked some of this through, they would be ushered off into a private room, the doors would be closed, and they'd have to decide on a president before they could come out. In secret, right? And this was again trying to surmount the problems that were inherent in the Virginia plan. Another idea was that the legislature, the national legislature, would appoint the executive, but only states, through some kind of electoral appointment process, could reappoint the president, right? Again, trying to get around this idea of the president being subservient to Congress. All of these oddball efforts show that the Virginia plan's idea was failing and had failed. And James Madison summed it up on July 25th when he said, quote, "The option before us is between an appointment by electors chosen by the people and an immediate appointment by the people." And Madison said that he preferred election by the people, but he pointed out two problems. First, people would likely prefer candidates from their own state, and that would benefit the biggest states to the detriment of the smaller states. Second, and related to that, a few areas with high concentrations of voters could dominate everybody else. Madison spoke, on the other hand, only positively of the idea of some kind of electoral college, finding that, quote, "there would be very little opportunity for cabal or corruption in such a system." Others echoed Madison's concerns and raised additional objections of their own. Gerry said a popular election would be radically vicious because it would, in effect, hand over to organizations capable of manipulating public opinion the selection of the president. Another delegate predicted that a national election would become complex and unwieldy. By the end of August, the Constitution was almost done. Just a few issues remained, and the biggest of those was this question: how do we elect the President of the United States? A committee was selected, one delegate from each state present, so they're called the Committee of 11. It included James Madison, and they were given this task on August 31st. Go and figure this out. They brought back a plan on September 4th, and it was adopted the next day with minor changes. And it is the Electoral College, as it is written in Article 2 of the Constitution. This is what it says. Each state shall appoint, in such manner as the legislature thereof may direct, a number of electors equal to the whole number of senators and representatives to which the state may be entitled in Congress. It goes on in Article 2, Section 1, to prohibit federal officials from being electors. Actually came up once. Oregon had an elector disqualified for that reason in 1888 or 1876. To require electors to cast 2 ballots, and to prohibit them from casting both ballots for candidates from their own state. A deadlock for president is decided by the House, and casting 1 vote per state, a deadlock for vice president is decided by the Senate. The runner-up under the original system became vice president. This last provision made John Adams miserable, I mean absolutely miserable, when his arch nemesis Thomas Jefferson became his vice president after the 1796 election. And then, of course, it almost robbed Thomas Jefferson of the presidency when his unscrupulous running mate, Aaron Burr, tried to manipulate an unintended deadlock in the Electoral College to result in his own election as president for the House. Of course, that didn't work out for Aaron Burr, and ultimately didn't work out very well for Alexander Hamilton, who brokered the election of Jefferson over Burr. The 12th Amendment, which was ratified in 1804, fixed all of this by requiring electors to cast separate votes, 1 for president and 1 for vice president. And there things stand, constitutionally at least. The state-by-state presidential election process has remained the same for 205 years. Now, state legislatures use their power to direct the manner of choosing electors in various ways, appointing them directly, holding elections by district, or most of the time, electing them all in a statewide popular vote, winner-take-all. Most legislatures have determined, and mathematically it's correct, that system maximizes the power of a state in presidential elections. 1 statewide winner-take-all vote. Maine and Nebraska, of course, do it differently. In Maine and Nebraska, they elect 1 elector from each congressional district, and then the remaining 2, who represent the senators in that tally, in the statewide vote, the way everybody else does. Of course, it's easy for American voters to forget that when we vote for president, we're really voting for electors. Civics education is not what it used to be, and perhaps the Electoral College is, in a way, really a victim of its own success. Most of the time, the Electoral College shapes our politics in ways that are beneficial but very hard to see. When its effects do jump out in the open, that is only because some candidate and his or her political party has just lost a hard-fought and narrowly decided election. All of a sudden, we remember that we have this Electoral College, and some people wonder why we do. But what are the beneficial effects that are sometimes so hard to see? What are the beneficial effects of the Electoral College? Or to put it another way, if James Madison was here today, it's one of the reasons I like this question. I mean, sometimes as conservatives, I think we can lapse into saying, well, James Madison said it should be this way, so we should do it this way. But I think the more important question is, if Madison was here with us today, right, he wouldn't want to know what he said 205 or 215 years ago. He would want to know what's happened over these last 200 plus years. What would Madison say? What would Madison think? One obvious result of the Electoral College is a practical respect for states, both their boundaries and their legislatures in presidential elections. While the federal government has assumed many powers once left to the states, election administration remains primarily a state function. The current system contains presidential elections within state lines, allowing elections to remain relatively decentralized. Of course, some see this as a flaw. Senator Elizabeth Warren recently called for abolishing the Electoral College and linked this to her support for more federal power over elections. At a CNN town hall in March, Warren called for a constitutional amendment to replace the Electoral College with what she called national voting. And this is one of the reasons, actually, why the organization that I used to be with, the Freedom Foundation in Washington State, took this issue on to begin with. We did a lot of work on election integrity. Some of you may remember the Dino Rossi governor's election in Washington State in 2004. And we recognized that pretty much all of the groups behind National Popular Vote, this effort I'm going to talk about in just a minute, saw it as a part of a strategy, a part of a vision to centralize power over elections, to take the power away from the states and put it here in Washington, D.C. The Electoral College has prevented that, and even its critics recognize this. But containing elections within state lines has other benefits as well. The Electoral College turns state boundaries into something like the watertight compartments on an ocean liner. Disputes over mistakes or fraud, real fraud, imagined fraud, whatever kind of fraud, are contained within individual states rather than spilling over into a need for nationwide recounts or, again, greater federal control. This was important in America's messiest presidential election, which was not 2000, but was 1876, in my opinion at least. This was the first time a candidate won an electoral vote majority while another candidate received more popular votes nationwide. Some people say that was 1824, but that's not correct, because in 1824, 6 states appointed electors directly and didn't hold a vote in their state. There was no national popular vote in 1824, but there was in 1876. And this was during a period of time, during the rise of voter suppression and a tremendous amount of election fraud in the South. Tiny margins and obvious fraud in this election, and there was fraud on both sides in this election, but obvious fraud in this election led to disputes over the totals in Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina. These states literally sent to Congress competing slates of electors. The Democrats sent their electors, the Republicans sent their electors to Congress, and Congress had to figure this out. 2 days before Inauguration Day, I mean, again, this has got to be the messiest presidential election. 2 days before Inauguration Day, Congress finally finished counting the votes, determining to count the Republican votes in favor of Rutherford B. Hayes rather than the Democrat votes for Samuel Tilden. Democrats proclaimed this the fraud of the century. But there's simply no way to tell what the correct result was in this election. There was no way to tell probably at the time. It is clear that racist voter suppression would become an important part of Democrats' hold on political power in the contested states. And at the very least, and I agree with the historians who come to the conclusion that it's likely that the Electoral College prevented that racist vote suppression from stealing a presidential election. Although, again, nobody can prove that. There's some extrapolation that you have to go through to get to that result. But at the very least, the Electoral College contained those disputes within individual states so that Congress could sort them out. The next election in 1880 shows another effect of the Electoral College system. It often amplifies the result and enhances the credibility of a new president. The popular vote margin in 1880 was less than 10,000 votes. So this is about a 0.1% margin, right? Sometimes people who support a national popular vote system say, well, you did never have a close election if it was nationwide. You had too many votes for that. 1880 is Exhibit A for why that's not correct. Neither candidate in 1880 had a popular vote majority, which is the case in most close elections. James Garfield, however, won a resounding victory with 214 electoral votes to Winfield Hancock's 155. There was no question who won. The Electoral College often has this effect. It bolsters the legitimacy of plurality winners. This was true in 1992 when Bill Clinton won just 43% of the popular vote, but over 68% of the electoral vote. And, you know, this is a good thing, right? I mean, I think it's easy to see that a narrow plurality is inferior to a broad plurality, right? If you're going to have a plurality winner, it's better that that plurality winner is drawing support from a wide swath of the country rather than a narrow region or a few major cities. Perhaps the greatest benefit of our state-by-state election process, however, is the powerful incentive it creates against regionalism. And this is always true. This always informs how presidential campaigns are put together, but it's easiest to see in the late 19th century again. In 1888, incumbent President Grover Cleveland lost re-election despite receiving an electoral vote, a popular vote plurality. This happened because he won big in the South. Cleveland's national popular vote margin was 94,530, But he won Texas by 146,461 votes. In other words, some of you are making this connection, right? Texas for Grover Cleveland was in 1888 was California for Hillary Clinton in 2016, right? One state, intense support in one state was responsible for 150% of his popular vote margin. He had altogether, he had won 6 states. Cleveland had won 6 states with greater than 30%, while only tiny Vermont delivered with such zeal for Republican Benjamin Harrison. In other words, the Republican votes were drawn from a broader area with less intense regional support. And it's just fun to think about Vermont being the hotbed of Republican sentiment. They were feeling the burn, I guess. This election showed that radical support in one region of the country was not enough to win the White House. But Democrats already knew this. After the Civil War, and especially after the end of Reconstruction, the strength of the Democratic Party was in the South. You might think it would make sense that they would be nominating candidates from the South. That's where most of the Democrats were. That's where most of their support was. Instead, the Democrats nominated no Southerners for president or vice president between 1872 and 1928, if you exclude West Virginia, which of course you should, because West Virginia only exists because it stayed with the North during the Civil War. Nobody, right, from 1872 to 1928, they were doing everything they could to reach out into the North. And Grover Cleveland and his running mate, both Northerners, just like Al Gore in 2000, if Grover Cleveland had just won his own home state of New York, he would have become president. Winning the presidency requires something more than a raw popular vote plurality. It requires winning enough states to earn a majority of the Electoral College votes. Grover Cleveland did this. He came back in 1892 to become president again. It's why he's a common Jeopardy answer, right? He's the only person to serve 2 non-consecutive terms as president. He actually received a smaller plurality in 1892 because the Populist Party got 8.5% of the national popular vote, but Cleveland won a resounding Electoral College victory because he won his home state of New York. He won his running mate's home state of Illinois. He also won Indiana, Wisconsin, and California. He broadened his coalition and won the Electoral College. And so it goes. Whether we see it or not, the Electoral College pushes parties and their presidential campaigns to build broad coalitions and then to focus on the most closely divided states. This has become a popular attack on the system. Swing states get a lot of attention and other voters feel left out. Yet more Americans live today in highly partisan, safe congressional districts than in quote-unquote safe states, right? If you don't like safe states, you should be really upset about congressional districts. But far more, by my calculations, about twice as many Americans live in safe congressional districts. If people's votes are being ignored or left out or not counted or something, it's a much bigger problem in the U.S. House than it is with the Electoral College. But the very legitimacy of a political party really rests on those safe states. Right? A political party, a national political party, has to have a broad base of strong support across the country. You have to have enough safe states that you can then credibly reach out in swing states to actually have an opportunity to win the White House. In 2000, people forget, people say in 2000, George W. Bush, the only state that mattered was Florida. If George W. Bush had lost any state that he won in 2000, he would not have become president. Right? And again, if Al Gore had won his home state, Al Gore would have become president. Right? Every single state mattered. Every state matters. Every vote within a state matters, at least as much as in elections for governor or senator, which are sometimes very close and other times foregone conclusions. This comes up. I go to hearings on the Electoral College in states all around the country, and I was in Nevada for a hearing a week ago. And this came up. There was all this confusion between a state senator and the lobbyist who was there against the Electoral College on which votes don't matter, right? Does your vote not matter if you're in a swing state but you vote for the loser, or if you're in a safe state and you vote for the winner? And they just talked round and round and round, and I got a good chuckle of it because it's confusing because it makes no sense, right? I mean, Many of us, at least, have lived in swing states and swing congressional districts and safe congressional districts, and the same with state legislative races and city council races. And the idea that how I feel about my vote or how my vote matters is determined by the margin in the election just doesn't really make a lot of sense, I think, when you tease that out. The Electoral College does, of course, put a premium on states that happen to be the most balanced in a particular election. But the flip side is, would we really rather the path to the presidency run through the reddest of the red states and the bluest of the blue states, right? Or would we rather it run through the states that happen to be the most evenly balanced? Consider one more quality of swing states. They are also the most likely to have both parties represented in government. To have divided government. If divided government is good for one thing, it's good for accountability. In other words, the way the Electoral College works out, when we do wind up with a razor-thin margin, at least it's likely to happen in a state where both parties have some power, rather than in a state where one party controls everything. Despite all these benefits, detractors maintain that it's simply unseemly for a candidate to win without receiving the most popular votes. Hillary Clinton said in 2000 that in a democracy, we should respect the will of the people, and to me that means it's time to do away with the Electoral College. Yet similar systems prevail around the world. I didn't used to point this out, but I've realized, I was in a hearing in Maine at the beginning of the year, and somebody said, well, if we just abolish the Electoral College, we would have higher voter turnout like they have in Canada. And I thought to myself, maybe these people really don't realize what a parliamentary system is, right? I mean, everyone assumes that Canada, the United Kingdom, Australia, India is oftentimes talked about as the largest democracy in the world. Everybody assumes all these countries are democracies, and I've discovered that some people assume that that means that they vote directly for their executive. But of course, that's not true in any of those countries, right? They have parliamentary systems. They elect their prime ministers in a two-step process that is arguably less democratic. I think it's clearly less democratic than our Electoral College system is, right? I mean, Theresa May did not get elected based on anything like the national popular vote. I mean, nobody even cast a vote for her in even a two-step process, right? They cast a vote for the Conservative Party for their member of parliament. India and Germany actually also have, Germany has a chancellor, India has a president, and in addition to their parliamentary systems and their prime ministers, they actually have something very similar to an electoral college. India calls it an electoral college. Again, the largest democracy in the world, designed to do exactly everything that we've talked about here, to balance out geographical interests, to prevent regional radicalism from tearing the country apart. And by the way, on the other side, the countries that come to mind when you think of a national popular vote, Russia and France. And if you've followed Russian and French elections over the last 20 or 30 years, you will know that they have not been uniformly happy with the outcomes of their elections for a variety of reasons. Most recently in France, where the first round of their election, Macron gets 24% and Le Pen gets, I think, 21%, right? And most of the proposals to get rid of the Electoral College would leave it right there, right? 24%, you win. France has a second round. They have a runoff system. You know how many French voters were unhappy with that result, with having a choice between a 24% candidate and a 21% candidate? So many French voters were unhappy with that they didn't just stay home. They went to the polls, and 600,000 French voters cast a blank ballot in protest at their national popular vote democratic system, right? And of course, right here at home, what matters most in every legislative body, from the Oklahoma House of Representatives to the United States Senate, is which party is in control. That party elects leadership and sets the agenda, and in neither chamber of Congress nor in any of the 99 state legislative chambers does the national popular vote matter at all. What matters is winning districts or winning states. And I mentioned the hearing in Nevada. I just have to say this because it was a high point of my year. There were two people from the National Education Association at the hearing to testify against the Electoral College. It's undemocratic. Our students don't like it. You should get rid of the Electoral College. And I thought, I think I know how the NEA elects its president. And I looked it up on my phone, and when I testified, I was able to share with the committee that, of course, the NEA elects their president through basically an electoral college system, their constituent assembly. So a lot of people don't realize that this electoral college system isn't quite the out of left field anomaly that people portray it as. Nevertheless, we hear the clamor of voices calling for an end to the Electoral College. Some of this is just sour grapes and posturing. Opposing this part of the Constitution has become an emblem of the resistance, and it fits neatly within the progressive idea that whatever might help them obtain power must be progress. Hillary Clinton said recently that we have evolved beyond the Electoral College. Former Attorney General Eric Holder declared it a vestige of the past, and Washington Governor Jay Inslee identified it as one of several archaic relics of a bygone age. Democratic presidential hopefuls from Beto O'Rourke to Elizabeth Warren have jumped at opportunities to call for abolishing the Electoral College over the last couple of months. In fact, what some of these Democrats might realize, or their advisors perhaps, is how similar their party's position in the 21st century is to what it was in the late 19th century. California is becoming, for the Democratic Party of today, what the South was for their forerunners. The Golden State accounted for 10.4% of the votes cast in 2016, while the southern states, from South Carolina to Florida and over to Texas, you kind of draw that triangle in your mind, those southern states accounted for 10.6% of the votes cast in 1888. Cleveland won those southern states by nearly 39%. Hillary Clinton won California by 30%, so not quite the same intensity, but close. In other words, rather than building the broader coalition required by the Electoral College, some modern-day Democrats would rather change the rules to increase the chances that their current narrower coalition can win the White House. Well, whether for posturing or politics, calls to amend the Constitution are a dime a dozen. Even anti-electoral college amendments with broad bipartisan support in the 50s and the 70s failed to receive the required two-thirds support to be sent to the states for consideration. Partisan amendments are not going to make it through Congress anytime soon, nor will they win ratification from the states. There is, however, a serious threat to the Electoral College. Until recently, it has gone mostly unnoticed as it has made its way through various state legislatures. If it works according to its supporters' intent, it would nullify the Electoral College and wipe away all the benefits by creating a de facto direct election for president. How is this possible without changing the Constitution? The National Popular Vote Interstate Compact, or NPV, takes advantage of the flexibility granted to state legislatures in the Constitution. Remember, each state shall appoint in such manner as the legislature thereof may direct a number of electors. The original intent here is clear, of course. It's to allow legislators to determine how best to represent their own state in presidential elections. The electors represent the state, not just the legislature, even though the latter has power to direct their own states, to direct the manner of appointment. NPV would have states ignore how their own people vote and give away all of their state's electors to whichever candidate that state believes won the national popular vote. Excuse me. Of course, no state would do this unilaterally. So NPV has a trigger. It only takes effect if adopted by enough states that they control to gather 270 electoral votes. In other words, a majority that would control the outcome of presidential elections. So far, 14 states worth 189 electoral votes have adopted the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact. Until this year, every state that had joined was deep blue. California, Connecticut, Hawaii, Illinois, Maryland, Massachusetts, New Jersey, New York, Rhode Island, Vermont, and Washington. The NPV campaign has struggled to win a few blue states. Delaware only adopted it this year. It still has not passed in Oregon. Excuse me. Although it may pass there soon. Following the 2018 election, Democrats' new trifectas in purple Colorado and purple New Mexico wasted no time joining NPV, but others have not. Democrat legislators actually helped to kill the measure this session in Maine and New Hampshire, and some seem unsold at this time in Nevada. If NPV ever did take effect, it would have all the same effects as abolishing the Electoral College outright. Fraud in one state would affect every other state, and the only way to deal with it would be to give more power to the federal government. An especially close election would require a nationwide recount. Candidates could win based on intense support from one region of the country or a small collection of big cities. NPV's jury-rigged direct election system also brings some unique risks. Despite its name, the plan cannot actually create a national popular vote. National Popular Vote Interstate Compact does not create a national popular vote. States would still, for the time being, run their own elections. This would mean a patchwork of rules for everything from which candidates get on the ballot in particular states to how disputes are sorted out, and it would reward states for having lax election laws. Just imagine with me 2 states side by side. Everything about those states is identical, but one state has laws saying you should show photo ID to register to vote and to cast your ballot. And we're going to try to have strict controls for election integrity. And the state next door says we're going to allow felons to vote from prison, as Bernie Sanders suggested the other day. The state with the lax election rules would benefit, right? Would have more political power under national popular vote than the state with stricter election controls. I don't think that goes unnoticed by the advocates here. Finally, each NPV state would certify the national total for its own, on its own, right? And the question here is interesting, right? Because the NPV compact, it's actually not very long. It reads very simple, and it is portrayed as if the benefit of it is it's very simple. It just doesn't mention a lot of things, like how you would decide a dispute. But think about this. Every state within the compact would certify the national popular vote election result for itself. Well, so what happens in a hard-fought election when California voters are watching on MSNBC and being told that the margin of victory for the Republican candidate is only because of voter suppression in some southern red state? Or flip it around, right? Republican voters in Texas are watching Fox News, and they're watching scenes from Chicago and being told that the Democrats have they're ahead by a narrow margin, and it's only because of ballot box stuffing in Chicago, right? What are those state officials who supposedly are going to certify an election total based on what other states tell them, all trust, no verify, no power to determine the veracity of what any other state says, and all these officials are elected officials, they're politicians, most of them are people who want to become either governor or senator in their state, that's who secretaries of state typically are, right? Are they going to, how are they going to respond when they start getting phone calls from donors saying, I just saw this on MSNBC or I just saw this on Fox News, don't you dare certify a national election total that includes California's votes or Texas's votes or whatever, right? And there's just literally no way to sort this out under the NPV compact. The only certain result of the national popular vote compact would be uncertainty, including litigation. The NPV compact is at least constitutionally dubious, although it is not. Sometimes I have conservatives tell me, I don't worry about this because it's clearly unconstitutional. It is constitutionally dubious. It does something nobody's ever tried to do before. For one thing, it does ignore the requirement in the Constitution that interstate compacts receive congressional consent, but NPV lobbyists point out no court has ever enforced that constitutional provision to strike down an interstate compact. Would they do it in this case? Maybe. Judges might also hold that the structure of the Constitution's Electoral College Clause does imply some outer limit to the power of state legislatures to ignore the will of their own people. This came up in a hearing earlier this year where a committee attorney in the Nevada legislature, again, was insisting that national popular vote is legal, is constitutional, but he did say, he said, but we're not arguing that the legislature could do anything. We're not arguing that the legislature could sell their electoral votes. And what's interesting, I kind of looked over at the national popular vote lobbyists, and I've been following these guys around for 10 years, and so I know who they are, and I kind of watch them squirm because their argument is that no, the legislature could do whatever it wants. Right? There's nothing in the Constitution that says you can't sell your electoral votes, just like there's nothing in the Constitution on its face that says that you can't rob your state's people of their electoral votes and give them away based on how people vote in New York and Los Angeles. Right? The question is, does the original purpose of the Electoral College control or not? And again, I don't put enough faith in judges to say that I'm not going to worry about it based on that, but I do think there's a live question there. However, uncertainty might be part of the objective, or at least might play into the hands of Electoral College opponents. If you know the history of the 17th Amendment, Part of how we got the 17th Amendment, which took away the power from state legislatures to appoint their U.S. senators, was because opponents to the existing system created a tremendous amount of uncertainty and unease around that system, and eventually Congress did what they had refused to do up to that point, was usher out what became the 17th Amendment for direct election of senators. Well, one danger, of course, to all these attacks on the Electoral College is that they succeed. One danger is that they succeed, that we lose the state-by-state system designed by the framers and thus lose the protections against regionalism and fraud and the recognition of states as states in our constitutional system. This would alter our political ecosystem in some obvious ways, shifting power towards urban centers, for example, but also in ways we cannot be sure of. Small plurality winners would be more likely. Would that lead to a rise in splinter parties or spoiler candidates? Would conservative fears of election fraud in places like Chicago lead to a demand from the right for greater federal control over elections? And I really think in a direct election world, I think it would be conservatives who would demand that the federal government take more power over elections because of concerns about election fraud. And in that case, right, I mean, conservatives would, if I'm right, conservatives would get what they want because that's been an agenda item for the left for a long time. The danger, however, is not merely that the attacks succeed in eliminating or neutering the Electoral College. The more fundamental risk is that the public adheres to the beliefs that underlie these attacks, that the Constitution is out of date, that the measure of an election is voter self-esteem, and that democracy is an end in itself. All of these beliefs can as easily be turned against any of our constitutional checks and balances. The measure of our fundamental law is not whether it actualizes the general will. That was the French Revolution, not our revolution. The measure of our Constitution is whether it tends towards justice and things that support justice, including stability. The Electoral College does this, and we ought not only to preserve it, but also to help our fellow Americans understand why it matters. Thank you very much. And I'm happy to take questions until Matt tells me to. Okay.
Well, thank you so much for speaking about this incredibly important subject. Many questions, which I'll save for after, but one in particular is, and I came a little late, so maybe you touched on this very early on, but there is a proposal that many Republicans have been in favor of over the years of breaking a state's electoral votes down by congressional district, what Nebraska and Maine already do without any legal opposition, so it presumably is legal with the 2-senator bonus, as it were, to whoever wins the state overall. What is your sense of this, that a state should be integral onto the whole in how it votes, or would a breakdown by congressional vote maybe make people in certain states feel more satisfied while preserving the system?
So as a general rule, in any state that tends to go one direction for president, the people on the other side want that system. I used to live in Washington State, and that was always something that would come up. Why can't we break up our electoral votes? Of course, it doesn't happen because Washington's a Democrat-leaning state. The Democrats control the state. They benefit from a winner-take-all system because it does maximize the impact of the state as a state. I mean, as a general rule, right, I think this flexibility in Article 2 where legislatures can figure out how to represent their state, I think is a good thing. But I think also as a general rule, the Maine and Nebraska system is, it brings with it the obvious problem that you bring gerrymandering into presidential elections. And that's why, I mean, I did this calculation a few years ago, so I was just curious. I had a hunch, but I wanted to see how many Americans live in safe states versus safe congressional districts. And as I mentioned, I mean, it's twice as many, because of gerrymandering, twice as many Americans live in non-competitive, by my calculation. It's sort of subjective, but I used a 5% threshold. So I think that's an issue, and I also think that I have had a problem with Republicans who have talked about it very explicitly as a way to game the system. Democrats actually tried to do that in Colorado in 2006, put a measure on the ballot to do it, and voters voted it down because they kind of figured out that it was Democrats being opportunistic. And that was 2006, right? Democrats thought, we're never going to win Colorado statewide, but at least we should get 45% of its electoral votes. In 2008, they won Colorado. So I think there's a big danger for partisans trying to be, too clever by half. Sir, yeah. I'm just making sure you get the mic.
My question's a little outside the box, but I don't understand what exactly they intended by an elector. And in other words, my impression, without knowing a lot, was, they would vote, everybody would vote for electors who would be people who would be intelligent, honest, competent, and it wouldn't be this sort of political vote. It would just be, let's get some people to study the issues. And I kind of think on a national level, voting is kind of a crazy thing because people can't possibly understand these issues. I read about them all day long, and I don't really think I'm a competent person to understand, all these issues and the implication throughout the entire country. So I think it would be a good idea to have an elector whose job it is to study these things. And that's what I thought an elector was. But correct me about why I have a misconception, which I'm sure I do.
Well, no, you don't have a misconception at all. I mean, it's really it's related to the reason I mentioned, or one of the reasons I think I mentioned I like this issue. I mean, this is an issue where, partly because the framers settled on it so late in the convention, and because the Anti-Federalists were okay with it, we know that some of them thought that states were just going to appoint electors, the electors would get together, they would cast votes for president. If there was an obvious choice like George Washington, that person would be elected. If there wasn't an obvious choice, probably people would vote for a favored son candidate. And then maybe because they cast two votes and one had to be for somebody from another state, maybe you'd still wind up with a George Washington, almost somebody who had that level of prominence, or it would deadlock. And I think there's there is some evidence that a lot of them thought, the House is going to wind up doing this most of the time because nobody's going to get a majority in the Electoral College. But as soon as the system was in place and George Washington wasn't there anymore, the framers themselves, the people who designed this system, basically started using it in a partisan way, the way that we use it today, started having elections. It was the Jeffersonians who came up with the winner-take-all system because they were upset that Virginia wasn't going all for them. And I think it's one of those areas where the full weight of the founders' intellect was never brought to bear to do a really rigorous, how is human nature going to interact with this constitutional structure? And they wound up discovering for themselves through their own human nature, how it actually works. But no, I think. But
what did they envision an elector was supposed to do?
Well,
they must have had some idea.
I mean, yeah, they thought that they would get together in their own states and deliberate. I mean, that's at least some of them thought that was what was going to happen. I mean, as you describe, but the record is thin, right? So we don't know that they all thought that, but we know some of them thought that. And of course it worked out that way for George Washington, but everybody knew it was going to be George Washington anyway, right? And I do think, one of our problems that is just outside of this whole question of the Electoral College is the aggrandizement of the executive, the president, and I don't think that it's one of the reasons I worry about a national popular vote system. That further aggrandizes the executive, and that is actually an argument that some Democrats in the Trump era recognize, and some Democrats back in the George W. Bush era, when they were all upset about the Iraq War and what they thought were abuses of presidential power back then, there were some Democrats opposed to national popular vote for that very reason. They said, we don't want presidents claiming to have a clear popular mandate because we think that'll make them even more, feel even more free to steamroll Congress. Here and then over there, I think.
This may also be a little off the mark, but there are some states now run by Democrats who are trying to put a requirement on their people who can run for president in their state to, in this case, provide their tax returns. Now, that's strictly local politics, but let's say that states tried to put more of the requirements on presidential candidates than are in the Constitution, which sets up who can run. I'm pulling a bad example out of my back pocket. My state will now not allow anybody to run for president who doesn't pledge to never take military action against North Korea, Pakistan, Iraq, a litany of a pledge to do something, in my case, foreign policy. What do you think of that, and how do we prevent that?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because that has been going on in a number of states. I think some states have it's actually been enacted, I believe, this session. Yeah, what they're doing, it's ballot access law. You can't be on their ballot as a presidential candidate unless you've released a certain number of your years of tax returns. Of course, functionally, I mean, these are really hardcore blue states. They're going after Donald Trump. It will be interesting, because it harkens back a little bit to, and again, it harkens back to the South post-Reconstruction, when some people don't realize there were some jurisdictions where nobody voted Republican because that wasn't an option on the ballot. I think it's unconstitutional. So the short answer, and I haven't studied this, I've just sort of followed it out of the corner of my eye. I think it's unconstitutional under the term limits decision, because there were states that tried to create term limits on members of Congress through this same mechanism, and the court struck these down and said just what you said. You can't apply additional requirements beyond what's in the Constitution. So that's my instinct on that, and a good reminder to. We'll be
litigating the question of tax returns, I'm sure.
Yeah, it certainly would be. Roman. There we go.
First of all, thank you so much for what you're doing. You talked about the centralization of power in the federal government, but you didn't talk, and I wonder what your thoughts are, on the concentration of power, not just in the federal government, but in the office of the presidency. Because if you have national voter standards, Congress cannot possibly deal with all of the details of election law in a bill. And so what, in effect, this would require is for some federal agency to promulgate regulations which, under current constitutional law, don't have to be approved by anybody. And the president, of course, appoints, because of the Appointments Clause, these individuals would have to be appointed by the president. And even if it was a bipartisan commission, they could be removed by the president for cause. So what you really, the argument is, and I'd be interested in your reaction, you're really giving the President of the United States and his appointees or her appointees the power to dictate the election process all over the country for their own reelection. And rule number one to prevent tyranny is don't give the chief executive the ability to control the rules for their own election. Is that a valid argument here in this case, do you think?
Oh, yeah. I mean, that...
Just be on the last question.
Okay, sure thing. I mean, no, that is absolutely correct, and something I oftentimes point out to state legislators. And again, I mean, a reason why there have been, I mean, I want to emphasize it's not, there's a partisan angle to this, obviously, after 2016, but there have been many Democrat state legislators who have recognized exactly that point, right? We don't want presidential appointees in charge of presidential elections. That's banana republic stuff, right? And obviously in the present climate, that that has particular reason to frighten people on a certain side, and everybody should be concerned about it. No, that's exactly right. For all kinds of reasons, anything like national popular vote would aggrandize the federal government. No, I'd be happy to stick around and chat with folks during the reception. I'm so thankful to Hillsdale College and Matt Spalding for entertaining me, and for all of you listening to all of this. The Save Our States Project was created particularly to track this national popular vote effort at the state level, and also make the case more broadly for federalism, particularly in elections. And so, I mean, I encourage you to, you can go to saveourstates.com or find us on Facebook. We try to push out a lot of information about what's going on in the states, particularly because that's where all this is happening. And this is a wonderful issue for the following reason. Most state legislators have never really thought about the Electoral College. So, I mean, myself, other people who work on this issue, I mean, you can go and sit down with a legislator who has sponsored the bill to get rid of it, to go for a national popular vote, and oftentimes find that they're genuinely curious about the issue, walk them through all of these arguments that I've laid out today, and I've had numerous legislators say, I'm going to go take my name off this bill. I now understand this is a bad idea. So this really is an area where individual citizens have made a tremendous difference in the defense of the Electoral College, and I hope you'll join with me in doing that. Thank you all so much.